and welcome. So excited to keep the party going and really, really excited for our guest today, Bob Doto. Hey, Bob, how are you doing?
I am good. Thanks for having me. Super psyched to
Yeah,
talk about this wonderful world of Zettelkasten.
indeed. Well, let me give you a quick intro to get everyone up to speed, myself included, because Bob is a pretty impressive individual. So my personal interactions with Bob, I think it came when I just attended the Building a Second Brain cohort, this last cohort for the first time. Wanted to return the favor that Tiago did by attending my workshop. And Bob was one of the alumni mentors. And I jumped into his sessions on Zettelkasten and I thought, finally, it's making sense. Zettelkasten, it's being presented in a way that I think is tangible and practical. And so I just struck up a conversation with you, Bob, and wanted to learn more and was really impressed by everything. Let me just read a little bit more about Bob's bio because I think it's so interesting. For 20 years, Bob has been teaching in environments as diverse as punk warehouses, the public education system, residential living rooms, online Zoom rooms, and at the college level. It just keeps going. Former managing editor at Parabola Magazine, prolific essayist, and he's been blogging under a lot of pseudonyms since 2001. So a decades long zine maker, magazine maker, and in general, an active voice in our PKM personal knowledge management scene. And like I have alluded to, I'm really excited for today's talk because I believe Bob can help cut through a lot of the ambiguity around Zettelkasten and present it in a way that is practical and empowering. So Bob, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah. I mentioned to you already, but I'll mention to everyone else, just a little disclaimer that I'm just getting over a cold. So you might hear me doing a little coughing. I'll try to edit those out. But last night was a whirlwind of fever. So I'm back. Fever's broken, ready to go.
And that means a lot too, because I know that you were emailing, Bob is sticking it out for us. So I'm just going to give my first of many physical rounds of applause to you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was really excited. Yeah, I didn't want to miss it. I love talking about it and I love getting into unpacking some of the confusions and just sort of laying a baseline for people. So I really wanted to try and make it happen. So here we are.
Wonderful. Well, hey, take it away.
Okay, here we go. So yeah, I've been where a lot of you may be or coming out of or just getting started in Zettelkasten. So I understand a lot of the so-called pain points or just the issues that come up with trying to figure this thing out. And they stem from material that's published online. It stems from the fact that we have to rewire our brain in a way to kind of understand how this system works and combine that with the speed and efficacy of the social media online world, just pummeling you with information about Zettelkasten. And it can be confusing. So I teach this 101, this little short class here to kind of unpack some of that. So here we go. So the wild world of Zettelkasten. Just so you know, I do run, I have a weekly newsletter that talks a bit about Zettelkasten. It's really mostly about kind of like lifestyle stuff, but I use PKM as a lens, one of the lenses I use for talking about kind of the human experience, as I call it. So if you're interested in that, I do these talks for free, and I often get a lot of great readers from these talks as well. So there's that. One other thing I'll mention is if you are interested in Zettelkasten and going deeper into Zettelkasten, I am running a 4-week on this, which is basically taking this short and blowing it out and getting into the deep minutia of the history of Zettelkasten, the confusions of Zettelkasten, the debates within Zettelkasten, and ultimately how to build out and work as Zettelkasten. So that's there as well if you're interested. So first, let's start talking about what is a Zettelkasten. So Zettelkasten is typically translated in 2 ways, though there are of course others, but basically it has to do with a slip box or card catalog. Zettel in German refers to a slip of paper or a note card or just a note, and Kasten is box. If you were to be living in Germany, you would hear this term much more frequently than you would if you lived in the US, for example. We don't really have Zettelkastens in the US. You know, though we do have boxes of cards you could buy, it's not something that's, you know, regularly available or regularly in need, right? But in Germany, any box of cards would be called a Zettelkasten. So I like to mention that because what we're talking about is kind of a reified, kind of objectified in the not negative sense, understanding of what a Zettelkasten is. We're talking about Niklas Luhmann's version of a Zettelkasten. There have been many people who've used cards in some sort of fashion to ideate and link thinking and et cetera. But when we talk about Zettelkasten, we tend to be talking about Niklas Luhmann's particular take on Zettelkasten or on a slip box. So Niklas Luhmann, this is where we get our contemporary understanding of Zettelkasten. He worked in an analog fashion. So he was working with actual slips of paper in physical boxes. Didn't really look like the one on the right, though his boxes were as he needed them, right? So a bit more makeshift, but he certainly had slide boxes as well. The reason most of you probably know about Zettelkasten is from Sanke Arens, right, in his book, How to Take Smart Notes. It's the most popular kind of access point or door into Zettelkasten. And I'll be talking about how he fits into this conversation just as we go. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I'll certainly refer to some of where Sanke splits from the teachings of well, not really the teachings, but the practice of Niklas Luhmann. Another person who not everyone knows about, so I'm trying to promote is Johannes Schmidt, Johannes F.K. Schmidt, who is like the head of research in charge of Niklas Luhmann's actual analog slipbox. So he's the one who preserves this material. He is the person who makes it available for research. And he has also written a bit on Zettelkasten. He has 2 articles in particular. One is actually a shortened version or abridged version of a longer article. And there's one other article as well, where he sort of does a deep dive into how Niklas Luhmann actually physically worked with the cards, how he developed ideas. And that 3rd article is really informative as well. At first glance, you don't necessarily know it's about Niklas Luhmann's Zettelkasten because it's about a subject Niklas Luhmann was covering. But within that subject, within unpacking that subject, you get to really see how Niklas Luhmann worked. You also get to see that Niklas Luhmann kind of abandoned his Zettelkasten at the very, very end of his life, which is not to say that he discredited it or had any feelings that way. He just had created close to 100,000 notes. And at the very end of his life was basically had boxes of manuscripts in progress where he would throw notes into, right? So the last couple of years. But for 30 years prior, almost 40 years prior, he was very much committed and devoted to the maintaining his Zettelkasten. Today, you'll find that many people, if not most, are working in a digital context for Zettelkasten. So on the left, you'll see something you're probably very familiar with if you're here, which is Obsidian, which is not a Zettelkasten specific program, but it handles Zettelkasten very, very well in the digital sense, or it can, but it's not. That is not its sole purpose. I use Obsidian to work with my Zettelkasten, to build out my Zettelkasten. On the right, you'll see the archive, which is kind of the more austere, very kind of Zettelkasten centric. The platform was built specifically for Zettelkasten. So it's in plain text markdown files, similar to Obsidian, but with no face on it, right? It's just the raw text there, the raw plain text, that is. So these are two kinds of ends of the spectrum. Now you can, of course, in a digital sense, build a Zettelkasten in many platforms, some of them more useful than others, but these 2, and even Rome to some degree, can be used for this. In fact, many people use Rome. And of course, there's the analog as well. So what is a Zettelkasten? So a Zettelkasten is really 2 things, okay? A Zettelkasten is a way of doing things, right? So it's a methodology. It's a way of behaving, a way of note-taking, and a way of note-making, and a way of note-linking. And it's also a physical and / digital object, right? So it's the object, the thing we can look at, touch, hold, type into, bring up on our computer, write on pieces of paper, the boxes themselves, but it's also a way of engaging with that object. So to start, I'll just talk about the physical digital object. I put little Sankei Arens down here in the bottom left because I'm going to use his terms. I don't actually subscribe to his terms as much as other people do, but I have a feeling these are the terms you're most familiar with. So I'll be using these terms interchangeably with other terms, and I'll tell you when and why I'm doing that. But just to give you a sense, this is how Sankei Arens, because I have a feeling most of you or many of you have read this book, how he breaks down the Zettelkasten. Now, first thing I should say about the Zettelkasten is that the Zettelkasten, when we're talking about it as an object, isn't one thing, right? A Zettelkasten is a container comprised of multiple compartments, okay? Excuse me. So a Zettelkasten isn't just your slip note, your atomic notes, so-called atomic notes. That is not your Zettelkasten. That is a piece or an aspect of your Zettelkasten. The Zettelkasten is actually multiple compartments being used together, often linked, where the notes in those compartments are linking to one another. So as Sankei describes it, he breaks it down into Zettels as one compartment. Interestingly enough about Sankei's book is one of the contributions he makes or attempted to make, at least through the English translation. This is another side note, but the German to the English translation is problematic for how to take smart notes. And people who have trouble with the book in English tend to miss the fact that what he said, how it's translated in English isn't exactly how it's said in German. For example, he doesn't give a title to the main, what he calls the main notes in the slip box. He simply calls them that, the main notes in the slip box. That would be one compartment. Another compartment would be literature notes, which I think is an unfortunate name. And this is a point where the English translation really does a disservice to the book. In Sankei Arens' How to Take Smart Notes, in German, there is no such thing as a literature note per se, as in a concrete kind of note. Literature notes in the German are notes used to take, are slips of paper or digital files used to take notes on literature. That's all it is. In the US, or certainly in English-speaking countries, we see these notes as kind of specific kinds of notes, and they certainly have become that in some sense. But in the German, it's a lot less sort of concretized, right? Literature notes is Sankei's term for a number of different kinds of notes. Bibliographical notes. This is somewhat of how Schmidt refers to those notes. Citation notes, or what I use and what I think is actually a better term is reference notes. Your second box in your Zettelkasten, or your second compartment, are the notes you take on information you're taking in, basically. They're references to either books, to videos, to podcasts, to media, right? So you could also call these media notes if you like. But they're basically, in the physical sense, Luhmann had a piece of paper or a card he didn't write in his books. And when he came across something that was interesting, he wrote a page number and then wrote a brief little thing about it, you know, farming or some quick idea, you know, page 77, just some quick idea there, but nothing that was really useful yet. It's more just references for him to refer back to. And he kept these. On the back, he would have written the bibliographic information or somewhere on the card. And he kept these in his Zettelkasten. These would have been called a permanent, as Sankei calls them, one of the permanent notes in the Zettelkasten that Luhmann would have linked other notes to. So we have Zettels, we have reference notes, and then we have, for Sankei uses the term project notes. So many of you, if you've read it, have probably come across this term. You really won't find this term in the other literature. You certainly don't find Luhmann referring to it because Luhmann didn't name his notes. He just called them notes. At one point, he refers to his index, but that's about as much as we get. Schmidt will use much more loose terminology, just more descriptive terminology when referring to these notes. But nevertheless, Sankei has a category called project notes. And project notes, I'll show you in a minute, but project notes are basically notes that you use to work on a project, typically a writing project. For Sankei, these notes would be temporary. You would use them only until a project was done, and then you ditch them. But for other people, these notes turn into different kinds of notes. Structure notes can be somewhat related to project notes, so they're not the same. So these are the three compartments that Sankei talks about. When we talk about Nicholas Luhmann, Nicholas Luhmann really had two compartments. He had a compartment for his main notes, the so-called Zettels, what we in the community tend to call Zettels these days, just to give them some names so we all know what we're talking about. And reference notes, those so-called literature notes that I was referring to before. And Schmidt also kind of mentions this as well. You could also say that Luhmann had a compartment for indexes. So really, the point being is that the Zettelkasten is the entirety. So however many compartments you have, that makes up the Zettelkasten. So to give you more of a visual sense of how this would work, this is, some of you may have come across this online. It was a video that came up recently, but I think it's a really good visual for how these compartments work together. If you Google or YouTube or whatever video streaming platform you use, something along the lines of analog, wooden box, homemade Zettelkasten, you should come across this video eventually. But it's a really good demonstration of how these compartments work together. So on the left would be your Zettels. The person who was doing this was an ecologist, so he was writing about ecology. So his atomic single idea notes would have been on the left, or are on the left. The notes in the middle are the project notes, Sankey's term, right? Because he was an ecologist, he was working on a project on the history of ecology, as I understand it from the video. And in this middle section was basically a chronology, right? So these were notes referring back to the other notes that were building a chronology, since that was the project he was working on, or a history of ecology. And then on the right would be the so-called literature notes. In here, there are also indexes, but these are your references, or this is this person's reference notes. You can see them alphabetized, right? Excuse me. On the very far right, you'll just see slips of paper, and pencils and stuff for him to pull notes. But all together, this makes up what we call the Zettelkasten. Now, in a digital sense, you could structure this exactly the same. This is a version of mine in Obsidian. At the top, you see there's a big folder called Zettelkasten, right? That's the thing. That's the whole thing. And it's comprised of a folder for Zettels, a folder for reference notes, or so-called literature notes. Project notes, I'll be honest with you, I actually don't use project notes. I have it in there just because I was interested in toying with the idea and seeing how that worked, but I don't personally use project notes. I write in a different way, or I build projects in a different way. And then at the bottom, I have what are called needs finishing and sleeping notes. Needs finishing are exactly what they say. These are notes that I've taken that are on their way to becoming, actual usable Zettels, but are not there yet. So they're kind of in waiting. They're in purgatory. And at the bottom, I have sleeping notes. And these are notes where, excuse me, one of the things to know about Luhmann was that when he was importing notes, he wasn't just taking notes and importing them, right? He would write his citations on his literature note. He would turn whatever was interesting on that literature note into an atomic note, or what we would now call an atomic note, but a single idea note. But he would write that note in the context of other notes he already had, as best he could. If he couldn't, then it was a new stream of thought, completely unrelated, and would just stick it at the end. But 9 times out of 10, he's writing in the context, or with an eye towards what's already in the Zettelkasten. That means that's how he's establishing link. And when we're talking about linking your thinking, that's how he's doing it as he's importing notes, right? He's importing notes as they relate to other notes or other ideas. My sleeping notes are for notes that I was processing that I lost the thread, right? I kind of lost the plot, so to speak. I lost how they would connect to other notes. So I have them sitting there. I think they're good notes, but I haven't really figured out a way to tie them in yet. So they sit there in slumber. But again, just so I can hammer it home, a container comprised of multiple compartments. That's what a Zettelkasten is in its physical sense. Now, a Zettelkasten is also a methodology. So it's a way of doing things. It's what I call a note making and note linking system that helps people do two things. Okay, helps people make connections between ideas, because Nicholas Luhmann definitely saw it as a thinking tool. But most importantly, and I will argue this as long as I have to, until someone changes my mind, it was meant to enhance creative output. Luhmann is on record as saying that complex thinking happens during the writing process. He's also on record as saying that he doesn't know the value of a note until he actually takes it and goes to use it in relation to other notes for a project. Okay, so even though he describes his Zettelkasten as, I think it's like a second memory or external memory, something like that he refers to. I forget the exact language. It's also in German. Even though he was referring to it as sort of a cognitive system, he is using it as a writing system, okay? Anyone you know from history, for the most part, who is famous for using a Zettelkasten, Umberto Eco, a number of German writers who, if you're not in Germany, you probably wouldn't know. All these people were writers using their notes in order to write. Can you use a Zettelkasten for other things? Absolutely. But its foundation is in writing or in creative expression. And I mentioned that this is a little bit of a tangent, so I won't go too far. This is more for the class that I'm teaching outside of this. But I mentioned that because the focus of a Zettelkasten is really more narrow than people think. And I come across people online all the time who are looking to repurpose Zettelkasten for this, that, and the other thing. And I often find myself pointing them to Nick Milo here and to Linking Your Thinking. And it's why I appreciate Nick's work so much, because it fills this gap that Zettelkasten cannot, right? Linking Your Thinking is much broader. It can incorporate more. It's more like a life operating system. Zettelkasten is not, right? Zettelkasten is a note-making and note-linking system that helps you make connections between ideas so that you can enhance your creative output. And little arrows and circles to emphasize that. All right, so how do we do that? This is the most simple, super simple workflow you'll ever see, right? At its most very basic. You do that by taking notes, putting them somewhere, either analog or digital, linking those notes as best you can, and turning those links into creative output. That is the workflow at its very most basic, without any of the details and any of the discussions we have online. It's taking notes, storing your notes, linking your notes, and creating based on those links. But wait, not just any notes. So one of the confusions, one of the many confusions with Zettelkasten, certainly online, has to do with the notes and the many different kinds of notes people encounter when they first start looking up Zettelkasten. It was certainly something that threw me too as well. There are many different kinds of notes spoken about online, which is interesting because Luhmann didn't name his notes, right? So where these note titles are coming from, you can follow the track, but they don't come from Luhmann. They come from people trying to work with Luhmann's system. And it's completely understandable, right? I don't want to, point a finger at that we need a language. Language is empowering, and naming is empowering. So it's important that we have note names, I think, but there are many. And they're still being developed as we speak, right? So you've probably heard of fleeting notes. You've probably heard of, or maybe have heard of index notes. You may have come across literature notes, which we're obviously talking about. Structure notes are another note that's kind of popular these days. Certainly in the Zettelkasten forum, they're kind of the people pushing the structure note more than anyone else. Zettels, although I will say Luhmann did use structure notes himself. Zettels are notes, hub notes, project notes, permanent notes, atomic notes. There's so many different kinds of notes, right? And it can all get kind of confusing. So to sort of unpack some of that, I'm just going to look at a couple of these based on, again, Sanke Ahrens's book, because I have a feeling that's where you're familiar with. So these are the terms Sanke Ahrens, with the exception of Zettels at the bottom. These are the terms Sanke Ahrens adds or brings to the discussion of Zettelkasten. Fleeting notes, permanent notes, literature notes, and Zettels. Now there's a confusing point in here, which I'm going to get to, because permanent notes is one of the issues, but let's start with a fleeting note. So fleeting notes is Sanke's term for just notes, right? They're notes you've taken. They're the notes we've been taking since time immemorial. They're the notes you were taking long before you came to Linking Your Thinking or Zettelkasten. They're just notes. They're jots. They're the things you write down or type into your phone, key into your phone. They're just the things you capture, right? So jotted ideas, checklists, drawings, meeting notes, margin notes, all this stuff are what Sanke would call fleeting notes. It's a bit of a misnomer to call them that. I actually like this term. I think it's a good term because I think it helps distinguish between notes we capture and notes we import into a Zettelkasten. But there's nothing special about this category. These are not notes specific to Zettelkasten. These are literally just the notes you write down. One of the issues I have with the English translation from Sanke Aaron's How to Take Smart Notes is his use of the term permanent notes. So permanent notes refers to two kinds of notes in Sanke's book, literature notes and Zettels, right? So what do I mean by this? Sanke was trying to distinguish between notes that are fleeting, so that are not permanent, notes you just take and you eventually transform into permanent notes. He wanted to make that distinction, which I think was a good distinction. But in the process, he sort of inadvertently created a new kind of a note called a permanent note. And a permanent note is not a note. A permanent note is just a description of a note that is stored permanently in your Zettelkasten. Now, this would all be well and good. Well, here's, and by the way, here are the quotes from that, right? The only permanently stored notes are the literature notes in the reference system and the main notes in the slip box. So he's referring to permanent notes as two kinds of notes, literature and Zettels. And then again on 42, he refers to permanent notes, which are stored either in the reference system, literature notes or reference notes, and as if written for print in the slip box, so Zettels again. All this would be fine and great if he didn't at some point earlier on in the book refer to permanent notes and literature notes, right? So you can see the difference, right? He's referring to permanent notes as literature and Zettels. Other parts of the book, he refers to permanent notes and literature notes. This is like the foundation of the confusion that's online. And it comes from a bit of a mistranslation and a misediting opportunity in the book. But nonetheless, these are the terms we have. But again, permanent notes are notes that are permanently stored in your Zettelkasten. So let's talk about one of these notes in particular. Excuse me, the Zettel. So again, the term Zettel just means note in German. And it doesn't really have a plural. We call them Zettels in the US. Zettels is not the plural of Zettel in German, but it's the same way that we do this a lot. We add an S in the US, and in English speaking countries, we add an S to make them plural. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. But if someone starts to point their finger at you, just let them know this is just how we roll here. But Zettels is we're just sort of taking the term for note, the generic term for note in Germany, and sort of repurposing it as a kind of note, the atomic single idea note that is stored and linked in a Zettelkasten. So the Zettel is the final edited, tidied up note. It's going to come from jotted ideas, checklists, right? It's built off of your fleeting notes. It's like your edited fleeting notes, but it's also your edited literature notes, or rather the ideas from your literature notes that you make and turn into Zettels. Once these notes have been pared down, refined, and edited, they become what we call a permanent Zettel note, right? The main note in the slip box. So what does that note look like? There's lots of ways to construct a Zettel, a so-called permanent note. But there's some general themes, right? So I'm going to present you with just one kind of general overview of how these notes tend to look. And I'll show you one of mine here as well that corresponds to that. So for some people, titles are important. Luhmann did not title his notes. These days, a lot of people title their notes. I title my notes. I'm a fan of Andy Matuszak's way of understanding the titling of notes. I don't follow everything Andy talks about, and we've certainly talked about this, and I've written about that, but the titling of notes I think is very important, at least for my work. So you'll often find a lot of people titling their notes. Your idea, right? Your note is about your idea. It's not just captured information. It's your interpretation of the information you're capturing. Tags, if you're a tagging person, not everyone tags, and there's reasons to and not to tag. But for some people, tagging is helpful. The source of your idea. Luhmann most likely, and it seems in most cases, did not source the information on the note itself. He was working in a bit of a small space. So that's why he would really rely quite heavily on those literature notes, because he would just put a reference to the literature note, like in a number or some sort of code, so that he knew where the idea came from. With digital, you have this option to include it, and I certainly include the source right in my note. And then, of course, links to other notes, which is the bedrock of the whole system. So here's like a made-up note. This is my little demo note for this class. So at the top, we have a title. In the middle, you have the idea. Below that, you have some tags. Below that, you have the source. And at the bottom, you have a link. So I'm going to start from the source, so from that white box. When I go to build a note, oftentimes I'm building off of someone else's work, right? I'm building off of something I've read. That's not always the case, and maybe it's 50-50, but oftentimes we do. When I do that, I have my quote, and I drop the quote with the reference right into the note. So for example, in this example, you'll see your mind, quote, "Your mind is for having ideas, not holding them." Classic GTD. The reason we're here is because of like that right there, that exact quote from David Allen's Getting Things Done. Now, previously, and for some people who are just getting started or people who have never heard of Zettelkasten, you might think that's the note, right? The quote is the note, but the quote is not the note. The quote is just your source for your idea. Zettelkasten is based on your ideas. That is, it has to be that way. If you want to write, when you go to write and you pull from your notes, you want to have your ideas, right? Not just a list of quotes. So you take the quote and then you interpret it based on what you're interested in or how you're linking this note, right? So if David Allen's quote is, "Your mind is for having ideas, not holding them," my interpretation of that, based on the context I work in, would be, because the mind is better at processing than it is at storing and recall, offloading notes can help relieve cognitive load. So that information is not contained in that quote, though it is certainly contained in David Allen's book. But for me, that quote from David Allen speaks to this other idea of the ability to offload information or the storing and retrieval so that you can relieve cognitive load. That's my idea based on what I'm interested in. So that's how the note starts to connect with other notes that are based in this train of thought. At the top, you'll see a title, and it's just more refined, right? GTD is a system that can help relieve stress, right? So when I'm scanning through my notes, I'm often looking at titles to get me in. So this note would not be called GTD and stress, right? This is the part that I take from Andy. This note has a statement, right? This is a statement about something, because a note that says GTD and stress, it sort of works, but it doesn't tell me anything about where it's headed, or it doesn't point to anything. It's just a subject at that point. So I title my notes in the way Andy does, which is to say something, to make a statement, so that I know where this note is directed, what it's going to be speaking to. And at the bottom are links, right? Contextual links to other notes that jump outside jump outside this thread maybe, and why I'm linking them. Just to give you a little more visual example, this is one of my notes. This is on Ignatian spirituality, which is an aspect of Catholicism. That's neither here nor there. It's just what the note is. It's a subject that I'm really interested in. And you'll see it lays out the same way that I've laid it out before, right? At the very top, you have the Zettel, the alphanumeric, you have the title in bold. Then you have my idea, you have the quote underneath where my idea comes from. I always want that there, because if I'm sticking very close to the quote, I want to be able to cite it, right? But if I'm jumping off of it, I don't need to cite it, right? Because then at that point, it's my idea. Below that, you'll see something called parent, a line that says parent. That's just telling me the note this is speaking to, or the note that precedes it, or the note that this is most directly related to. Beneath that, I have a section what I call jumps. Jumps are other notes on other subjects that this note could also attach to. That's the beauty of an atomic note, is that an atomic note, a single idea, can attach to many places, much easier than complex ideas. And the way I describe it is, when you build a thesis, right, you can write a 30-page paper and it's got a thesis, one line basically, right? 1-2 line thesis. 30 pages it took you to get to that one line, because it takes many ideas. When you have many ideas connected, it refines. When you have a single idea, it's expansive. right? A single idea can speak to almost anything, but 30 ideas working together really speak to one thing. So that's the benefit of the atomic note. So this is an atomic note as far as my definition of atomic note, and it's able to connect to other subjects. Okay, so this will take us into like the end phase of this, and then there'll be time for questions. So your Zettelkasten, the writing partner. So Niklas Luhmann is famous for having called his Zettelkasten a communication partner or a writing partner. Other people have referred to Zettelkasten in similar ways. This is how it works. You take your note, that GTD note, for example, and you drop it into your Zettelkasten, and it flirts and gets to know other notes in there, right? It's not isolated, it's not siloed out, it's among other notes. These notes, as you'll see over time, connect in that you've established links. Those links in my note are links. They are connecting to other ideas. Now, all these ideas are not relevant for a piece of writing that I might be doing, right? So say I want to write about basket weaving in Latin American countries, like a note on basket weaving might speak to notes on crafts, might speak to notes on things, you know, my grandmother did. She didn't, but if she did, and it might speak to things, you know, indigenous practices. So it's connecting in all these ways. But when I go to write, I don't want to dump all that in. I want to just take out the good stuff, the stuff that's most relevant. One of the downfalls, or not downfalls, but one of the potential problems of using a Zettelkasten is the desire to put every thought into every paper you write. And I see this all the time. You can spot a person who wrote with their Zettelkasten and wanted to put every note they had in the paper, like from a mile away. And what's really interesting is when you look at the literature, certainly pre-2000, you see time after time, reference after reference after reference to people reviewing academic work, speaking of Zettelkasten in the negative by saying things like, you can tell the author relied too heavily on their Zettelkasten. Nothing connects. It looks like just a bunch of notes dumped in. And you see this over and over and over again. So it's one of the problems, or not problems again, it's one of the things to look out for when working with a Zettelkasten. That's why I call Zettelkasten a practice, because you have to practice to get good at it. But for it to be a writing partner, I would eventually isolate, take out those links that aren't relevant, and I would just use the ones that were. I would then organize these notes, because notes in your Zettelkasten are, regardless if you use Fogelzettel or if you don't, if you just have notes kind of spread about the web of your ideas through structure notes and organized through structure notes. This is not an outline. Your Zettelkasten is not an outline. Your Zettelkasten is just showing you where ideas connect. But when you pull them out, even with Fogelzettel, where they're kind of in a bit of a hierarchy, sort of a tree, even that is not an outline, because you still have to take the notes and wrestle with them on your own. And that's what I was talking about earlier with Niklas Luhmann. Niklas Luhmann says, you know, I don't know whether these notes work until I go to actually use them, right? So it's when we use the notes, when we pull the notes and reorganize them and see what notes work and realize that some don't, that's when we start making our work. The simple way to do this, right? The reason people think of Zettelkasten as such a productivity machine or a writing machine, as Schmidt calls it, is because you can do this over and over and over again, right? You take ideas, you link them, you organize them, you lay them out on a page, you fill the page in with other stuff, new insights, changes, you know, negative space. I leave negative space for your own ideas. You have to massage the information into your own voice. But once you do that, you've got yourself chapters of books, blog posts, books themselves, right? You just stack all these linked ideas together and they create content. They create books or whatever you're looking to create, video scripts, whatever. So linked notes can become books, articles, videos, comics, rock operas, you know, just using it as a knowledge base, certainly fine as well. You can do so much with these atomic ideas once you start linking them. And once you do it a few times, once you actually start using the notes to write with, once you start taking notes out of your Zettelkasten, outlining them or laying them out on the page and really start working with them, that's when you see how the Zettelkasten starts speaking to you. Because you pick a note and you follow it to a thread that you forgot that you put in 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you realize that that idea is really rich as well. So it's kind of speaking to you from the past, right? Is another way to think of the Zettelkasten, is it's kind of voices from the past speaking to you. So just to finish, just a quick review on that workflow, and then we'll open it up. You're going to start with what Sankei calls fleeting notes, or just captures, jots, etc. These fleeting notes will eventually be turned into some form of permanent note, whether it's a literature note or a permanent Zettel. These notes, well, certainly the Zettels themselves will be put into the Zettelkasten, as will the literature notes. The notes that are in the Zettelkasten will then be connected, right? The ideas, those Zettels will be connected based on their ideas. Those connections can be formed into an outline once pulled out of the Zettelkasten and used, and that outline turns into creative content, essentially. And that is the end of my little spiel here. The main part is really just the questions. So we've got about 15 or 20 minutes to do that. So I would love to have either Nick or Dan, you can throw me some questions. Again, if you are interested in this stuff, 4 weeks, we're going to get into all this stuff in so much more detail. So feel free to hit me up for that as well.
All right, first, Bob, this is awesome. So let's give Bob some round of applause in the chat. I'll do it physically since you can see me. This is really great. Yeah, I mean, hats off to Bob. Also powering through, being under the weather. Really appreciate that. The chat is exploding. Before we go into the questions, and so both Dan and I can help kind of surface some of these for you, and then I can say them out loud, or you can check out the Q&A tab. But it's probably best if I say it out loud. Save your voice, and then you can answer. But I am curious, before we jump in, as part of this whole note-taking, note-making process, right now, what are some takeaways in the chat? What are something that you've taken away from Bob's presentation thus far? What is a takeaway? What is a connection you've made? What is an idea or an opinion that you've had? Generally speaking, what is your takeaway? So I'm just going to read out a few of these. It's a practice.
So nice to see everyone. I'm looking through these names. I recognize so many of them. Nice to see you all.
We have quite the amazing PCAM community out here in the world. It's just really neat to see. And the overlaps between the different subsets. Your Zettelkasten is not your outline. Fantastic simplified explanation of the Zettelkasten system. The focus of Zettelkasten is more narrow than you think, to quote you, Bob.
Yes.
And it goes on. I always like the takeaways, because that's us actually crowdsourcing the note making, taking and making process. Yeah, we have to put in the reps ourselves. We have to internalize what stands out. But this is just, I think, a really great thing. So please read through that, everyone, because there are gems in here. Literally, I see some gems in one of the chat messages.
Yeah, I would love to, if you do copy those, or if there's a way, I would love to see some of those takeaways at some point, because I can see just in passing, they look really great.
Yes, indeed. So with that, we'll transition over to the Q&A. Everyone, you can go into if you hover over your Zoom window, you should see near the bottom Q&A, click on that, and that will pull up the pop-up window. You can upvote the ones you want an answer from. You can also ask your own. I have them sorted by most upvotes, and we'll just start at the top. So I'll read this out to you, Bob, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay. So Ronnie asks, Zettelkasten was made in an analog world. Are there any aspects of it that you see being less important in a digital note-taking system with wiki links built in?
Oh, yeah. I really don't, honestly. Lumen's practice and methods, as far as I'm concerned, translate very, very easily over to digital. I come from, like, I don't read stuff online. I read stuff online, but I print out everything that I want to read, that I want to actually give some attention to. I read hard copy books, I don't read Kindle books, so I'm like a hybrid. I store my information in digital context, and it's probably why my Zettelkasten, it's why, like, I could never use Roam. Like, I've tried. I remember when I was first getting interested in some of the platforms, coming across Roam, being like, oh, this looks interesting, and then being like, what the F is this? Like I had no idea what was going on there. And I think in part it's because, I still think, I'm 44, I still think in terms of like physical objects. So for me, the relationship between the analog and the digital is very intimate, or can be very intimate. There are of course people who want them very separate, and that's fine, whatever they want to do. But I don't see any friction, so to speak, to appropriating Luhmann's techniques in a digital context. And I don't really think of anything. I will say I don't use literature notes like Luhmann did. I'll keep a few just on hand, but because my information is so digital in a lot of other ways, and because I'm linking source material right into the note, I don't really have a use for reference notes. Like I said, I will keep reference notes if I need them, but I can link out from Obsidian into the web or into like Abe's book page or whatever, wherever I'm sourcing my books from. So I'll keep reference notes just for citation, so I have them readily available, but I don't use them to the extent that Luhmann did. Though I've certainly done the card, slipped it in the book, and wrote page numbers. I think I have one around here, just floating around that I was using, but yeah, I don't see too many issues with that.
Excellent. There's a question from Dave, and we'll probably have to provide some context around it, but when is Zettelkasten not suitable to use? So probably in the context of, I don't know, notes and or creating something, expressing something. When is Zettelkasten not suitable to use?
Yeah, great question. Well, it's like I said before, in just the general sense, it's not life operating. It's not a second brain. That might be shocking to people. I don't consider Zettelkasten a second brain. I consider it a part of your second brain. I would consider your methodology, Nick, more along the lines of a second brain, because it's incorporating other things that are in your brain, right? My brain is filled not just with writing projects. There are other things, but Zettelkasten doesn't handle those other things. Whereas linking your thinking, MOCs, the wonderful world you've created and the people who've taken your courses have created are able to do these other things in their systems. So in that sense, that's when I don't use it. It's for other things. The other thing I'll tell you is that for short projects, I don't really use my Zettelkasten. Like I write a newsletter and it's coming out every week, which means I'm like on a deadline. So I'm writing quickly. So for that, I might pull a note from a Zettelkasten, or a couple notes just to jog ideas, but I'm not really linking too much because the material is so short. 500 words, a note could be 500 words, or not really, but a note could be 150 words plus my extra patter. So there's not really space to be really getting into that. So I use Zettelkasten for longer essays. So I distinguish between posts, newsletter, and then essays. So longer essays, we're talking like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 words and up. And then books, certainly I'd use it for Zettelkasten. But short stuff, tweets and stuff. Well, actually, Zettelkasten is good for tweets because you got those little sound bites, but that little gray area that little middle area is not where I use it so much.
Well said there. Our next question comes from Danny. Atomic or long form notes, how do you connect the ideas together?
Yeah, well, you and I have talked about this. So when it comes to Zettelkasten, I'm very adamant about the atomic note. And the reason is because when you go into it, when you go to pull from it, you want the stuff ready to go, right? You want to go in and not have to okay, you don't want to progressively summarize notes at that point. That's a whole different thing. It's a fine way of doing things. It's just different. With Zettelkasten, the whole point is that when you go in, it's already linked, it's already networked, the ideas are already parsed out. So in that sense, I'm very pro atomic note. That said, and this is where some of the confusion can come. When people are working in these two worlds of linking your thinking and Zettelkasten, understandably, right? Because there's a relationship there, certainly with some of the ideas and concepts. In your methodology, like what we talked about, you can start with bigger notes and let them collide, as to use your terminology, let them collide and split apart and collision and cleave into smaller notes as you need or as they need, right? As new information comes in, notes need to be broken down into smaller parts, if I understand what we were talking about. So in that sense, I mean, that's a very wonderful, beautiful way of approaching and handling information. The Zettelkasten just is like at the end of that train, right? It's the end of that process. So after the cleaving and the colliding, you would be left with the remnants, right? Which are these little bits. So that's how I distinguish the two.
Maybe on that point, and it's not a question, but it was actually came up in the chat. I'd like to jump in on it. So one of our presenters yesterday, Faye, is asking in the chat, I'd love to learn more, or saying in the chat, I'd love to learn more about how Bob converts notes for essay making. This is a pain point for me.
Yeah, so I mean, the question, how I convert Zettelkasten notes into an essay, or how maybe I don't understand.
I believe so. Yeah, kind of how you take those ingredients and then convert that into your essay making process.
Yeah. All right. So I don't have time to bring it up now, but if you were to see my graph, I don't use my graph too much, though I do use it. But the graph is a really great visual of how I can create trains of thought. And so when I have more time, I usually go into that. But basically, if you were to bring up a graph of atomic notes or Zettels, and you would, you hover over it in Obsidian, the node, and you'd see all the way. Because I'm using sentences for my titles, and this is why this is like a very practical reason, I can read the sentence, not be in the note, and be like, okay, that note is about this, and the thesis of that note is essentially this. Then I can go to the other one and be like, okay, that's connected, that idea. It's like not a different thesis, but it's a take on the idea. And what you have are basically 2 paragraph headings, right? It may not correspond exactly, but it very well can. When you refine the idea to a title, that's a statement like Andy suggests, what you have is the first sentence of your paragraph, essentially, or the main sentence of the paragraph. So you can see how the paragraphs connect because you're reading the first sentence of each paragraph, essentially. So if I'm writing if you're doing your like classic Rhetoric 101 college course, like 5-paragraph essay, intro, support, conclusion, it'd all be there, right? It'd all be there. You're just one idea, that's a paragraph. Next idea, paragraph 2, 3, 4, 5, or really 2, 3, and 4, and then 1 and 5 are the separate. But so that's how I would do it. That is how I do it. If I'm building out something a little longer.
Yeah.
There are other times when I'm just doing dumps, right? I'm just dumping notes. I'm like, these are all related, and I'll just suss them out. Sometimes I like to get dirty. I feel like I'm like making clay, like clay pottery or something. So that's another way to do it, which is just like bring the notes down and just start messing with them. My brain works very well that way also. So.
Yeah, actually, I think I just kind of want to touch on that again, and we'll make sure that we save the Q&A questions, because being able to go from these notes into a something, whatever that is, an essay, a rock opera, as you've alluded to, but that's a really valuable thing. And to take the stuff that we've kind of internalized or said that this is important, and then you just, like you said, it's almost as simple as try to just throw that statement into an outline and then just riff off of it yourself. But that way you have that holistic continuity of a narrative in one essay. So it doesn't have that fragmented Zettelkasten feel, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I would double down on that. When I write, I pull my notes from my Zettelkasten and then I forget I ever had a Zettelkasten. Like I don't want to know anything about it. Like I want to, then I'm working with material. I start, Tiago does have this great way of talking about starting from abundance, where you never start from a blank page because you've already got something to pull from. But I don't want to think about my Zettelkasten. I'm not going to go back and try to find more and more notes. Like once I have enough, it's like writing time, and writing time is a different way of behaving, different way of relating to the material. It's where it's now I'm in it, I'm in the material too deep to be going back and being like, what's another clever thing I can throw in? We don't need more clever.
I'm really digging that. And I hope if I can shine an even brighter spotlight on that, that is such a good way to just evolve from, notes into writing, and keeping you as the writer fully invested and involved creatively through that process. So it's not a copy and paste, but you're still there, you're living and breathing, but you've internalized all this. I just
Yes.
think there's
Yeah.
something really special.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not interested in people's notes. I'm not interested in how many notes people have at all. It's such a not important metric to me. What's important is like how they communicate, how do they relate to other people? And if they use their notes to do that effectively, then that's interesting to me. That person's, someone I want to know. But what do I care if you have 48,000 notes?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so a couple things here. We're coming to the very end. So here's what we're going to do. We'll save the questions as best we can. Dan, hopefully you can help me with this. I'm going to do a crude copy and paste, but maybe there's a better way. And then Dan has also shared a link where you can continue the conversation on Twitter. But I want to turn it to you, Bob. Where can people learn more? Again,
Yeah.
if they want to continue working with you, talking with you.
Right. So I'm recently going back to Twitter, so I'm starting out again on it. So if you want to have like kind of quick back and forth and just like throw questions out, I do love doing that. I love answering questions on this stuff. So Twitter, my handle is @the_high. I don't know what it is actually. My name is Bob Doto, and I think the handle is the High Pony. Yeah, the High Pony, which is my newsletter. So if you look up the High Pony or Bob Doto, you'll find me on Twitter, and that's good for just back and forth. I don't take offense. You can cold tag me, and that's fine. The class is obviously going to be a more hands-on, personal forum. There's going to be time to actually workshop your own notes, like your Zettels, like bring a Zettel. There'll be a whole nother open studio session each week so that you can be like, is this making sense? That kind of stuff. And then the newsletter, the newsletter takes all of this and frames it in like our human experience, right? So it's not PKM centric. It's like the human experience through the lens of PKM and some social stuff and spiritual stuff as well. So those are the 3 venues I hang out in. Oh, and my new blog.
And so the blog, to subscribe to that one, is that?
Yeah, I started a blog again. It's called, I think it's just writing.bobdotto.com.computer. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, writing.bobdotto.computer.
I know we
That's
shared
where all
it
my
in the
essays
chat.
going. Yeah, all my essays, like I'm writing bigger pieces on this stuff, the PKM stuff. I write longer form on, and that will show up there as well.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's just give one more digital round of applause in the chat for Bob. Bob, I mean, this was great. This is really what I was hoping to deliver, is a conversation around this. The chat itself is pretty rich too. Once people start talking about Zettelkasten, yeah, either the wheels fall, something happens, but it's definitely lively.
Yeah, always. Yeah, and thanks again. You've heard me say before, I'm going to embarrass you here for a second, but I really appreciate what you do in this forum. And even though we do slightly different things, the conversation, I think that just makes the conversation so much more rich, and the evidence is in the people who work with you and have taken your courses, and the stuff they're producing is really inspiring. So I'm always down, always happy to be a part of what you're up to.
Well, thank you so much. And again, for striving through the sickness, hardly noticeable. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, we're going to close out the session. I think with, if I have it handy, with some music, so we end on some good vibes. I might have closed that tab. Dan, do you have the special music tab? Dan might have the special music tab. But anyways, we're going to
jump back into the bed now. Sleep off.
Exactly. All right. Well, anyways, all the best to everyone. And until next time, stay connected. Maybe I'll see you in an hour for Eleanor Koenig's event. But yeah, this is just a blast. So thank you, Bob.
I'll be there. I'll be in there from bed.
Wonderful. Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye. Signing out. Bye-bye.